Welcome to HSBC Global Viewpoint, the podcast series that brings together business leaders and industry experts to explore the latest global insights, trends, and opportunities. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes. Thanks for listening, and now on to today's show.
Hello from Hong Kong and welcome to Under the Banyan Tree. I'm Fred Newman, Chief Asia Economist.
And I'm Herald van der Linde, Head of Asian Equity Strategy, coming to you from HSBC Global Investment Research.
We are weekly co-hosts here on the podcast, but every once in a while it takes on a more interviewer-interviewee kind of vibe, and that's the case on the show today.
That's indeed the case, Fred. You interviewed me for the Equities Outlook a couple of weeks ago, and now it's my turn to ask the questions to you about the macro outlook for the year. I want to talk about trade, tariffs in 2026, consumption, central banks, and I also want to know what a K-shaped recovery is because I've been hearing you talking about that.
Well, bring it on, Herald. From HSBC Global Investment Research, this is Under the Banyan Tree, where we put Asian markets and economics in context.
So, Fred, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions this time around, and I want to start off actually with trade because that was the big topic of 2025. And I remember that you said on this podcast a couple of weeks ago that actually trade has been pretty strong this year because a lot of that was kind of brought forward. People wanted to get their stuff in before the tariffs were imposed and the prices would go up. So that means that trade must be really kind of collapsing at the moment. Is that the case?
Not really, Herald. And this is perhaps one of the big surprises in 2025 because you have all these headlines about tariffs in the U.S., of course, up, down, a lot of uncertainty. But if you look at actual trade volumes, we're running at record global trade volumes this year, and particularly out of Asia. So Asian exporters on the whole have actually done quite well. Now, why is
that? To the U.S.? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, it's partly to the U.S., but it's also to other parts of the world. Now, part of this is, of course, because of the fear of tariffs. Maybe some importers into the U.S. have front-loaded their purchases.
Yeah.
But actually, the evidence for that is not very strong. It's probably played a role, but it's not that strong.
Okay.
And so there are other factors driving this. One must be the extraordinary AI hardware boom that we're seeing. And, if we think about in the U.S., the estimates are around $450 billion in data centers investments this year alone.
Of course. And where do they get the chips?
And all of that comes from Asia. Now, the chips are the obvious one, right? And that you talk about Korea and Taiwan being very much exposed to that part. But it goes beyond that. If you think about the cabling that goes into these data centers, if you think about the ventilators for cooling, that comes out of Asia. If you think about the fact that they need to bring in electricity generating machinery, that comes out of Japan.
Components and all these
and even hard disk drives out of Thailand. So it's really the broader Asian ecosystem that really got buoyed by this AI.
But I suspect that the Korean and the Taiwanese export numbers, they must have been good because that's really the chips and that's the expensive stuff, right? And has that been the case?
That's been the case. But interestingly, it's very narrow categories, right? So, economy like Korea exports thousands of different goods from big shipping vessels to tiny microchips and plastics and chemicals and petrochemicals and all cars. But it's really the export performance was largely carried by just these tiny, tiny chips who are soaring in volume, but even more so in value. So that bolsters sort of
prices
the reported exports that these countries report.
And I also remember we spoke with Aris, who looks at ASEAN economics, and he was talking about that the ASEAN economies were actually exporting more to the US now than China as a group, right? So there's also some supply chains that are being moved around and they benefit from some slightly better tariff structure. So it's not just these countries, but I guess it's a phenomenon across the whole region that trade just remains
That's
strong.
right. There's some evidence that ASEAN economies have gained a bit of market share in the US. at the expense of China, probably. But that doesn't mean that China's exports themselves were doing badly because China has increased its exports to the rest of the world. So China's exports are running at record levels. ASEAN's exports are running at record levels. So everybody has had a very good year. And that hints at something else. And that is, it's not just the tariffs. It's not just the AI hardware boom. But also the world is demanding more goods nowadays. So consumption patterns have shifted towards consumption compared to, say, 10 years ago. We buy more stuff at the moment. The type of investment that's undertaken in the world right now has moved from sort of software and research investment really more towards stuff.
Yeah.
And so that benefits trade per se. And so that's why actually we had a pretty good year here in Asia when it comes to trade.
That's interesting because there's a debate in equities, and I want to move on to consumer in a second here, but there's a debate in equities that should we be pricing companies that were software companies, very asset light, don't need a lot of debt, that now become data centers that are very investment heavy, therefore need a lot of debt, and debt is a risk. Should we be pricing these companies now differently as well? So that's a sort of a kind of, you could say, an equity reflection of what you just mentioned. So exports have remained really strong across the region for all the reasons you mentioned. Consumption, is that something, because that was the talk at the beginning of the year, if the export would slow, and that's not the case, maybe governments need to do more to boost domestic consumption. What's happened on that front?
Well, here's a bit of the puzzle for 2025, and that is traditionally when exports are doing well, domestic demand in Asia does well as well because these economies are highly export oriented. As exporters do better, they hire more people, they pay out more bonuses and wages, that drives consumption, they invest more, that needs more workers, and so we see domestic demand picking up as well. The trouble this year is we don't really see that in the data. Consumer spending generally across Asia has actually been quite sluggish. Despite the good performance in exports. And so here you see a divergence in economic performance. And what you could argue, this is sort of a K-shaped recovery. And this is a term
I wanted to get into what is that, a K-shaped recovery?
Yeah, K-shaped recovery. So the term originated really from this idea that within consumption, there is higher-end consumers that have more income actually can spend a lot because maybe they own a lot of equities and equities are doing better, but that lower-end consumers are struggling, and so the broader consumption is lagging behind. So you have this divergence within consumption. The rich are doing better and the poor are doing not so
Interesting, because a couple of weeks ago we spoke with Erwan Rambo, the luxury specialist we had, and he was in Asia here, and that's exactly what he saw in the luxury markets. The high-end really doing well, low-end luxury, and we're talking about luxury, that's in general already high-end, of course, but he said low-end luxury is really struggling. There's a lot of things going on. So sort of K-shaped recovery there as well.
So you see that in general consumption patterns in Asia, and it has partly to do with the fact that the AI hardware boom, for example, is driving exports in a very narrow set of companies. And they are doing phenomenally well. But it doesn't mean that the economy is hiring more workers because these are, say, chip companies that are firing up, they're churning out more chips and they're making a lot of money. But that doesn't mean that they're hiring tens of thousands of workers.
And again, you see that being reflected in equity markets. You see some stocks and markets have done really well and other ones have really struggled this year. So that K-shaped recovery is something that I can use in my equity universe as well.
Yeah, that's another great example of how equity strategies copy really the intellectual work of economists.
Normally we don't really want to listen to you guys because we look ahead and you guys look backwards. But in this case, maybe there's an exception here.
Yeah, and so there's other elements as well to the K-shaped recovery. And particularly in poorer economies, they're still scarring from COVID-19. So, we all like to think the pandemic is behind us. But socially, particularly in poor economies, the average household has really suffered quite a bit because they didn't get the fiscal transfers that maybe American households got from the government or European households in the UK.
So they are in a more difficult situation.
So they, the average Indonesian, the average Indian, the average Filipino, they all struggled much more. They had to dip into their savings. And now coming out of the pandemic, they need to rebuild their savings. They need to rebuild their nest egg.
And that takes a couple of years.
Takes some time. And so that contributes to the K-shaped recovery as well.
And what does that mean for investments then? Because you have one part of the economy doing really well, other parts of the economy still struggling. So I guess you have a bit of a K-shaped recovery in the investment cycles as well.
Well, in the investment cycle, I suppose you do to some extent, although that's probably more a question for you and how within equity markets there's some companies that do better and others maybe not. But I think the big question mark now is for policymakers. How do they respond? Because you have on the one hand, you have very strong growth. I mean, we had just had news out that the Taiwanese economy is expanding over 8% every year in the third quarter. I mean, these are rock solid numbers.
I can't remember. I used to live in Taiwan 25 years ago now, but I can't remember seeing any sort of number like that coming out of Taiwan.
In decades. Haven't, maybe around COVID when there was collapse and then base effects. But this is roaring growth. But this is driven by a few companies. And so that doesn't mean then that the economy is generating inflation. Because there's no broad-based growth. And so if I'm a central banker, I'm saying, oh, yeah, I got strong growth, but the inflation picture actually is very benign. If anything, inflation is going down. So there might be an argument to cut interest rates because really the aim of central bankers is to lift everybody up, not to benefit a few economies. So that's one aspect. But there's also implications for fiscal policy. And that is that because the average person is not benefiting from this strong growth, there's more pressure on fiscal policy to help the average consumer. And this is something new we haven't seen in Asia, whereby fiscal policies geared more towards spending vouchers are being handed out. Maybe there's discussion on expanding Social Security. So this is more social type of spending. Whereas in the past, Asia was very good at infrastructure, the hard stuff. But now you see these governments responding a bit more towards the need of the average person, and that also changes the discourse among policymakers.
Well, I'm learning a lot here, Fred. I want to take a quick break here and then maybe zoom in on 2 or 3 economies in Asia, just to go a little bit deeper on this.
That sounds like a plan.
So, Fred, for me to get it clear, so basically the economies in Asia have shaped up differently than we would have expected at the very beginning of the year. You would have thought with all the tariffs, maybe the trade would eventually slow. Hasn't really happened. That's because of the AI boom. And we've seen a big divergence, what you call a K-shaped recovery in consumption and maybe investment across the region, right? Now, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper and go into a couple of countries, what's going on. In particular, China, for example, that's a dominant place. What do we see exactly these trends unfolding in China, and what are they doing to deal with this?
Yeah, so China fits this pattern very, very well that we described because exports running at record levels. In fact, in many measures, China even outperformed the rest of Asia, which in itself has done quite well. So that part is doing well. But on the domestic side, the consumer spending is lagging behind. And that partly, of course, is a result of the real estate market, which is deflating and still actually, of course, of this year is, take another leg.
It seems like it went up and then it struggled, then it went up a bit again, and now it's coming down again. It's really up and down,
though the latest numbers are a bit discouraging. But it's not just that. It's also the weak labor market. It's, income growth is slowing. We have a slight tick up in the unemployment rate. So all of that is holding back consumer spending. And therefore, you see the government starting to talk more about allocating more money towards consumption, helping households. We had, for example, this year, free childcare being announced.
There's a lot of talk about pension reform. That takes time, I guess. But all these sort of, as you mentioned, these sort of social policies, instead of the sort of hard infrastructure, building bridges and roads that they used to do, say, a decade ago, right?
Now, some people argue the shift hasn't been fast enough, but we are seeing clearly the direction changing, even if the speed might not be quite there, what many people hope for. But there is a greater emphasis on that to address that K-shaped recovery, if you will.
And you could argue it will be difficult for them to cut interest rates that much more because it's already quite low in China.
They're already quite low, and so they kind of exhausted a little bit their monetary policy channel, as we call it. So the emphasis is more on fiscal policy, and that's generally true in economies that already have low interest rates. You know, cutting interest rates doesn't give you as much bang for the buck. You need to move to fiscal policy, and that's clearly what we see happening in China.
Then India. India had some phenomenal growth coming out in the last week or so. So what is going on there? Are they also benefiting from this AI K-shaped recovery, or is there a different story there?
There's been a bit of a K-shaped recovery as well. You had very, very strong growth, 8.2% headline GDP growth third quarter, phenomenal. Now, if you dig a little bit through the numbers, it turns out there's some statistical quirks, so maybe the run rate is closer to 7%, which is still very good. There, part of the growth has really come from the government cutting taxes and offering more support to consumer spending. And that's given the economy a bit of a jolt in the third quarter. But it is a K-shaped recovery in the sense that over the last few years, again, it's been certain sectors that have done well, not the broader economy. Rural consumption has lagged behind in recent years coming out of the pandemic, in part because of the severe impact of the pandemic on household finances in rural areas. But then you also had environmental issues. Last year there was a heat wave, right? And if you think about half the population is in rural areas and you have severe drought and water issues that immediately impacts consumer spending. So, but on the other hand, IT services are doing well, right? So it's a bit of a mixed picture. But generally, India has also weathered some of the external challenges quite well this year. They have very high tariffs right now. They're facing in the U.S. 50%, more than any other Asian economy, and despite that, they still manage to drive up growth.
These growth numbers is very good. So India, slightly different story. Now, we've spoken about Taiwan and to a certain extent, I guess, North Asia already. So what about ASEAN? And the biggest economy there is Indonesia. What's moving on there? Because that's been a sort of a confusing story as well this year.
It's a confusing story. Now, overall, ASEAN is really a mosaic of different types of economies, as you well know, Herald, and different economies have different growth drivers. Indonesia really is a generally more domestically focused economy because it is such a large population, close to 300 million people. And it's been traditionally much more exposed to the commodity cycle. But if we look at the performance this year, headline numbers, they're okay, around 5%, although they never really much move. But we know that consumer spending is very sluggish. We know that in the manufacturing sector there were job losses this year. And we see that also reflected in very low inflation numbers because inflation is so low, partly because people aren't spending. And this then has led essentially to a fiscal policy response, what we just discussed, which is kind of a trend we see across Asia, whereby the government is now emphasizing more spending that helps households directly. One is the famous
the school lunches.
School lunches, for example. And that's meant to help the average person really save money, make money, food available for their kids when they're at school, address nutrition deficiency, etc. So there's a subtle shift here. It's not clear in whether this is enough to drive long-term growth because you spend on very worthwhile causes, of course, school, nutrition, but the risk is that you then maybe scale back the infrastructure investment, which is driving the future growth. So it's a fine balance they'll need to strike. And I think going to next year, that will be one of the key questions, how Indonesia balances those two things.
Interesting. Maybe the last country I would quickly want to go to is Japan. We've spoken about North Asia, but Japan seems to be in a slightly different sort of cycle, right?
Slightly different because it's one of the few central banks that will likely hike interest rates next year, whereas everybody else
probably
is
the only
cutting.
one I know of that is doing that.
Yeah, there's a little bit New Zealand, Australia, where things are shifting a bit towards tightening. But in emerging Asia, really, it's probably more towards cuts than hikes. But Japan's firmly in a tightening cycle, and that's because Unlike in the rest of the region, the labor markets are very tight. And they're tight for demographic reasons. They're running out of workers. And so that drives up wages, drives up inflation. And here we are after 30 years of no inflation in Japan. We suddenly have some of the highest inflation rates in Asia and Japan. Who would have known? But that means there's a slightly different cycle there. And there's other stuff that's happening in Japan that's kind of suggests as a reinvigoration of the economy. They're doing quite well on some of the AI hardware stuff and semiconductors, for example. The tourism sector obviously doing still quite well. And consumer spending is also coming back, particularly among young people. Young people are spending again. Japan, it's not the older people, but the fewer younger people they have, they are spending, and because they often have jobs that are higher paying jobs. And so, yes, there's a more dynamism now in Japan that we've seen, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, Fred. So can we tie this all together? What does this mean for growth in 2026?
Look, the headline numbers this year are strong, but there is a certain degree of fragility to growth, right? The K-shaped recovery, for example. And that means that as we look into next year, we're not necessarily looking at dramatically accelerating growth because we have to be mindful of the drags that are still in these economies. And also there is a vulnerability that because everything is so dependent on export growth, if there's a pullback, then that could immediately impact how these economies perform. Now, that doesn't mean we're looking at recessions in Asia. It's just we have to be mindful of the fact that despite these very stellar headline numbers, there are these underlying fragilities, and I think that will cap growth to some extent. Asia will continue to deliver some of the highest growth rates in the world, very impressive, but we're not necessarily looking at a breakout year that sees suddenly this reinvigoration. I think for that we may need to wait until 27, 28, and particularly we need to wait for the Chinese economy to turn that last corner, turn over that last leaf of its property market.
For that we need that fiscal spending, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Well, Fred, I'm going to compliment you here. You've been an excellent interviewee. Thank you for letting me ask the questions today under the Banyan Tree, and we'll be back to our regular co-hosting shift next week.
We will indeed, and thank you, Herald. Pleasure as always. And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us today. Under the Banyan Tree is available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. And while you are there, do also tune into the Macro Brief, our other weekly podcast from HSBC Global Investment Research.
Have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you for joining us at HSBC Global Viewpoint. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes.